John Plis with the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, and on behalf of my own boss, Congressman Frank Wolf, as well as our co-chair, Mr. Jim McGovern of Massachusetts, I'd like to welcome all of you to today's briefing. As we all know, human rights and especially treatment of religious minorities are an ongoing question regarding the U.S.'s relationship with India. And I feel as an organization within Congress that deals with human rights, too often we don't have the luxury to look back at history and the way governments have handled accountability for problems that they've encountered in their past, and the way the past continues to affect the status of a country's population in its present. Fortunately, we have a chance to examine a very valuable and illustrative case of how this might work today. We're discussing the 1984 Anti-Sikh pogroms that took place in that year and the aftermath and accountability process that took place in the wake of those incidents. I'd like to thank especially Singh, who's been incredibly helpful from the Sikh Coalition in putting this event together. He'll be our moderator for this discussion for the film screening. We'll start with a film screening and then we'll go to a discussion followed by questions and answers. So thanks again for your patience in getting started, and I look forward to a great program this morning.
Thank you, Yvonne. My name is Rajdeep Singh. I serve as Policy Director for the Sikh Coalition, which is the largest Sikh American civil rights organization in the United States. I want to begin by extending our gratitude to the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission for making history. This is, in fact, the first ever congressional briefing on the November 1984 anti-Sikh pogroms. The November 1984 anti-Sikh massacre claimed the lives of several thousand innocent Sikh civilians, men, women, and children throughout India. And a lot of the time people ask us, why are you still focusing on this issue? It's been 30 years. This is the 30th anniversary year. Why have a briefing 30 years later in 2014? Well, the reason for that is threefold. One is the victims of the massacre, the families, more precisely, of the victims of the massacre, the survivors, the widows and orphans are still alive, and they're still waiting for justice 3 decades later. And so we owe it to them in the memory of their loved ones, and we owe it to them, the people who are struggling for justice, to keep this issue alive so that their memory is not lost, the lives lost are not forgotten, and that we sustain their hope that justice will be done. The second reason why this briefing is very relevant today in 2014 is that the perpetrators, the architects of the November 1984 anti-Sikh pogroms, are still alive and have eluded justice for about 3 decades. And so as long as we have an opportunity to bring justice to the victims of this violence, as long as we have an opportunity to deliver justice to the people who lost loved ones during the 84 pogroms, this briefing is still relevant. And most pertinently for us here in Washington, D.C., India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi is scheduled to meet with President Barack Obama today. A few miles away from here, Prime Minister Modi will be discussing trade issues and defense cooperation issues with President Obama, as well as Vice President Biden. And the message that we'd like to send is that although it's important for these two countries to discuss trade and defense, it's imperative that they prioritize human rights and the dignity of all individuals, regardless of their religion, regardless of their nationality. So that's why this briefing is still relevant today. And what I'd like to do before I signal to Harpreet that we should begin the film is just talk about the panelists that you'll be hearing from today. Harpreet Kaur and Manmeet Singh are with Sach Productions. They are the individuals who created this film, The Widow Colony, which documents the struggles, the lives of the widows and orphans who lost loved ones in November 1984 during the pogroms. In addition, we're very honored to have Mr. Sukhman Singh Dhami from a human rights organization called Ensaaf, which focuses on impunity issues and accountability issues in India, with a focus on violence against Sikhs in India. And lastly, we're honored to have Mr. Manoj Mitta, who's senior journalist from India. He's visiting us from India. He's also the author of 2 groundbreaking books on mass state violence in India. One of those books is called When a Tree Shook Delhi, the 1984 Carnage and Its Aftermath. It was co-authored by the lawyer H.S. Fulka, and it is the most authoritative account of the November 1984 anti-Sikh pogroms. In addition, more recently, he published a book called The Fiction of Fact-Finding, Modi and Godhra, which documents the shortcomings in the investigation which followed after the anti-Muslim pogroms in the state of Gujarat in 2002, during a time when now Prime Minister Modi served as chief minister of that state. And we would love for Mr. Mitta to draw comparisons between the 1984 anti-Sikh massacres and the 2002 anti-Muslim massacres that occurred under Mr. Modi's watch. So with that, I would welcome Harpreet to begin the film.
Hi, everybody. My name is Harpreet Kaur from Sach Productions. I'm the director of this documentary, The Widow Colony. I want to thank each and every one of you for coming out to this very important briefing. Most of us were agonized and disturbed by the way people die, but we're absolutely untroubled by the misery and the destitute conditions that they live in. And that is the real tragedy. We forget the survivors. When human rights violations occur, numbers are recorded and it becomes history. Another gruesome chapter in the name of democracy, another book on the shelf, another workshop, seminar, conference, simply a statistic. Today we've gathered to commemorate the 1984 Anti-Sikh massacre. Most of you have never been able to put a face to the stories that you've heard or felt the enormity of the event. But what you've seen today and what you've heard, that is the reality. This is the untold story of 84. This is the chapter in history which was distorted, a dialogue which was never rightfully initiated, and a wound that has yet to be healed. The victims who have shared their stories in this film have fearlessly, concisely, and with confidence articulated their accounts. These women, they do feel neglected and forgotten, and that's why it's important for us to not only talk about 1984, but take the time to go to the widow colony and meet these women and give them our moral support. A simple embrace from one human to another has incredible strength. These women need to know that they're not alone. You know, I've looked into the eyes of these widows as they've shared their stories, and that experience, it not only makes you better understand what it means when we use the words violence, rape, or atrocities, but it makes you more human. A part of you, it sheds away, and another part comes to life. The conditions in the widow colony are heartbreaking. In 30 years, the problem has grown 30 folds. These families, the women, their children, they've been robbed of the opportunity of a successful future. Like every parent, they had dreams for their children and plans to prosper as a family. The opportunity to an education, employment, and the basic necessities was never there for them. You know, I'm often taken aback when people make comments along the lines that these women should move forward, they should have moved on, it's been 30 years, how long can one grieve? As if we're talking about a natural death, someone dying of old age or illness. Let us not forget that these women are victims of a government-sponsored massacre, and they will never forget, forgive, or have closure until justice is delivered. A brutal massacre took place in the world's largest democracy. India, its politicians, Kamal Nath, Jagdish Tytler, Sajjan Kumar, Taramdas Shastri, the list goes on. These men are guilty of committing these crimes. But instead of being punished, they have positions of power. The Indian government needs to be held responsible for its actions, and the guilty should be punished. This is the demand of every widow. They don't need an apology from the government. They want justice. An apology is only acceptable when the opportunity to give justice expires. They haven't given up. They haven't lost hope. They suffer, they grieve, but they're resilient. These women are our modern day heroes. They are the most courageous women that I have ever met in my life, and they will continue to fight and share their stories. Their memory has not faded, but the time to document is running out. Therefore, making this film was important to not only share their stories and archive them, but to bridge a gap between two communities which was created to stir hate. For too long, this issue has been wrongly projected, so we need to steer and elevate the dialogue about 84 in the right direction. Through the testimonies of the survivors, the film sheds light on the truth and has created the much needed dialogue among Sikhs, Hindus, Muslims, the international community, and all those who have been hesitant to even talk about this issue. While the film addresses the horrific violence and brutality that was unleashed on the Sikhs, it has given people the platform to talk and have a productive discussion, regardless of what their religious beliefs are or political affiliations. So we bring this issue forward through our film as a vehicle for dialogue, solidarity, and healing. Justice will be delivered when the international community and the forces in this room join the fight and hold India accountable for its actions. And that's why we're here today. A congressional briefing to commemorate the 1984 Anti-Sikh massacre has been held. I'm honored that I was invited to share my film and shed light on the issue through the work I've done. But the dialogue, it can't end when we walk out of this room. If you're here today, it's because you care, have the outreach and the power to make a difference. History will be written when justice for 84 is delivered. That will count as a true historic moment. So let this platform today matter. I'm going to leave you with a testimony that drove me to make this film, and Madhukeshwar had briefly talked about in the film. I hope it stays with you and reminds you why these widows continue to fight for justice and why every individual who values human rights should become a part of this cause and be a voice for this issue. Gurdeep Kaur's testimony. Gurdeep says on the morning of November 1st, when Indra Mata, referring to Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, her body was brought to Teen Murti, everyone was watching television. Since 8 a.m., they were showing the homage being paid to her body. At about noon, my children said, "Mother, please make us some food. We're hungry." I had not cooked that day, and I told them, "Son, everyone is grieving. She was our mother too. She helped us settle here, so I don't feel like lighting the fire today." Soon after this attack started, three of my men of the household ran out and were set on fire. My youngest son stayed in the house with me. He shaved off his beard and cut his hair. But the mob came into the house and dragged my son out, even though he was hiding behind me. They tore my clothes and stripped me naked in front of my son. When these young boys began to rape me, my son began to cry and said, "Elder brothers, don't do this. She is like your mother, just as she is my mother." Gurdeep Kaur, she was raped, 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 raped in front of her son 8 times by 8 men in her own home. May Gurdeep Kaur's words light a torch in your heart for justice. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Manmeet Singh. I am the producer for the film, and I thank Rajdeep, all the representatives here, and from their offices for giving us this opportunity. I'm just going to mention 2 incidences, and one is it's not only the politicians. The complaint is about the common person, and on the east side of Delhi, there is this doctor who still has his practice, and he's locally referred as Lambu Lambu, meaning the tall doctor. And what he had done during 84 was, as the 6 men were killed, he went with his bag, his medical bag, and he removed the eyes of these dead men and sold them later in the market for profiteering. And that tells you the degeneration of society when all of this happened. You know, what is the mindset of an educated man in such an environment? And he still roams freely. You can just go in, you can get medication from him. He has never been accused, and there are so many people who have given testimony against him. And that's why, because for them, it's not just the people, because I did see, I have seen Jagdish Titler at the Congress head office. I saw Sajjan Kumar in my last trip just go in front of me with all the security, and they're enjoying, VIP status. And that's why it really pains these victims to just see everything, the world has forgotten them and everything's just normal. And they just can't, and I got a very brief taste of this, a very, I would say, 0.001% in the last week. Why? Because the moral compass I work for IBM, and I know I'm going on record, and I was very upset that my CEO had a meeting with Narendra Modi yesterday. So I have to address that and send her a letter. And now we didn't open the gates for Kim Jong or Ahmadinejad. And why did we have to really open, the doors for Modi? And what's so special all of a sudden? And I understand state politics. So it's these things that people think about, and then they call me and they're like, why are the Sikhs getting so upset? Modi didn't kill the Sikhs, but the Sikhs have always been on the right side, whether it was the First World War, the Second World War, whether it was Gujarat, whether it's New Delhi. So our moral compass and our religious ideology keeps us in check. So I thank you again for the time, and we'll be here for questions. And I'll pass the baton to Manoj.
I too will begin with an anecdote. 30 years ago, Maina Kaur was a young woman in Delhi, all set to get married. Her modest home was filled with members of her extended family who had gathered for her wedding. It was then that a mob suddenly attacked her house. The attack was so brutal that it ended up in the murder of 8 of her family members, including her father, brother, uncles and cousins being killed. Maina herself was sexually assaulted and abducted by the mob, and she returned home ravaged and distraught after 3 days. Her wedding was called off as the trauma wrecked her physically and mentally. As if all that suffering were not bad enough, the Indian state failed to deliver any semblance of justice to her. None of the accused persons identified by her and her mother have ever been convicted. In varying degrees and forms, such is the searing story of thousands of Sikhs affected by the 1984 carnage. As somebody who's written on such repeated undermining of the rule of law, I deeply appreciate the gesture of Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission of the US Congress in organizing this event on the 1984 carnage, titled 30 Years of Impunity. The meeting honors the memory of those innocent persons who had been killed in 1984 and pays tribute to those survivors who had been widowed, orphaned, grievously injured, or rendered homeless. Let me also commend the Sikh Coalition for this timely initiative. I addressed a similar meeting 5 years ago in the historic building of the British Parliament, commemorating the 25th anniversary of the 1984 carnage. The ongoing struggles for justice in India gain strength from such expressions of solidarity from abroad. The shielding of mass murderers can't be passed off as internal affairs of any country. As Martin Luther King famously put it, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. When the world is being increasingly globalized on the economic front, it is apt to recall an old saying in India, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. The contemporary message that can be drawn from this is that whether the world is one market or not, the entire humanity is one family. Indeed, more than globalization of the economy, the world needs universalization of human rights standards and practices. The documentary we just saw, the circumstances in which the so-called widow colony had come into existence, testify to the horror and magnitude of the violence that we are commemorating today. Even for a country such as India, which is inured to mass violence, the 1984 carnage remains exceptional from a human rights perspective for at least 3 reasons. First, it was the closest that the post-colonial India ever came to a pogrom, as the violence was entirely or almost entirely one-sided, and the casualties almost entirely from one community, and there was hardly any instance of police firing during the 3 days that the killings went on unchecked. It was as if the entire state machinery had colluded with the mobs, targeting Sikhs in response to the assassination of Indira Gandhi by 2 policemen of that community. The second exceptional feature of the 1984 carnage was the sheer scale of the death toll, although the violence had largely subsided in 3 days. Since the partition riots at the time of its independence way back in 1947, India has never seen as much violence as it did in November 1984, in a carnage spread across far-flung places such as Delhi, Kanpur, and Bokaro. The third exceptional feature was that most of the genocidal killings took place in Delhi. Yes, right in the capital of the country that prides itself on being the world's largest democracy. The official death toll, as was mentioned earlier, in Delhi alone was 2,733. Given that I'm speaking in the capital of a country that considers itself the world's oldest democracy, I can't help wondering whether such a mass crime in which rampaging mobs had fatally attacked hundreds of people could have ever occurred in Washington, D.C. In the unlikely event of mobs taking over the streets of this orderly city, could the perpetrators of mass murder have got away with it? Could the security forces here have colluded with the mobs as blatantly as they did in Delhi? Could your president, at the end of it all, have dared to justify the mass murder, as Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi did, by declaring that when a big tree had fallen, the earth was bound to shake? Such questions would seem equally inconceivable about other leading capital cities too. Whatever the provocation, could there have ever been such massacres, at any rate post-World War II, in London, Paris, Berlin, or Tokyo? But if we look beyond liberal democracies, the scale of the bloodshed in Delhi 1984 is perhaps comparable to what happened in Beijing 5 years later during the Tiananmen Square massacre. But then those students at Tiananmen Square happened to be gunned down by security forces in a single-party political system. So the long arm of the law grabbed the protesters rather than the troops. Come to think of it, the death toll of Delhi 1984 was similar to that of 9/11. But again, there's a big difference. 9/11 was the result of sudden and unforeseen terror attacks, not mob violence that had deliberately remained unchecked for 3 days. By any standards of the civilized world, Delhi 1984 is one of a kind, a monstrosity without a parallel. Honored as I am by this opportunity to speak on the premises of the US Congress, let me dwell on the role played or not played by its counterpart in New Delhi in the context of the 1984 carnage. In the elections held within 2 months under its shadow, Rajiv Gandhi won the biggest ever mandate in the history of the Indian democracy. Consistent with the anti-Sikh frenzy whipped up by him during his campaign, Rajiv Gandhi was dismissive of the demand for a judicial inquiry into the carnage. As a corollary, when the two houses of parliament passed resolutions condoling the death of Indira Gandhi, they steered clear of any reference to the thousands of innocent Sikhs who had been killed to avenge her murder. This is in contrast to the alacrity with which the US Congress here passed a resolution condemning the post 9/11 attacks on Sikhs, although those attacks were isolated instances based on mistaken identity. That the victims of the 1984 carnage were purposely ignored by the Indian Parliament became evident from its expression of concern around the same time for another distressed community, the victims of the Bhopal gas leak caused by the negligence of an American multinational company. As a human rights defender, I urge you, the US Congress, to commemorate 30 years of that industrial disaster too. The Delhi carnage and the Bhopal tragedy were separated by barely a month, and there has been no closure for either of them. When the judicial inquiry into the Delhi carnage was finally set up after a lapse of 6 months, it turned out to be farcical, despite being entrusted to a sitting judge of the Supreme Court, Ranganath Mishra. All the proceedings were in camera, riding roughshod over the principles of transparency and accountability. It got worse when a few of the state actors appeared before it. The Mishra Commission ensured that their testimonies were recorded behind the back of the groups appearing for the carnage victims. On the basis of such official testimonies, which had thus remained untested by any cross-examination, the Mishra Commission absolved the Rajiv Gandhi regime of all responsibility for the carnage that took place on its watch. The crude cover-up did not end with that. When the Mishra Commission's report was tabled in Parliament in February 1987, the ruling Congress Party used its brute majority to gag the lawmakers. Given the tenuous nature of its findings, the government could not afford the risk of subjecting the Mishra report to a discussion in Parliament. In a brazen display of their pliability, the presiding officers of the two houses ruled out any debate on the report. There couldn't have been a more glaring abdication of the parliamentary function of holding the government to account on issues of national importance. Parliament's pusillanimity in the aftermath of the 1984 carnage legitimized impunity. The saving grace is that Parliament did finally discuss the 1984 carnage, and that was over 2 decades later. It was in a vastly changed political landscape long after Rajiv Gandhi himself had been assassinated by a Sri Lankan Tamil group. Though it was back in power when the discussion took place in 2005, the Congress Party this time was leading a tenuous coalition government. By a quirk of fate, its Prime Minister Manmohan Singh happened to be a Sikh. The discussion was triggered by the report of a fresh judicial inquiry instituted by its predecessor, another coalition which had been headed by the Bharatiya Janata Party's Atal Bihari Vajpayee. While tabling the report on August 8, 2005, the Manmohan Singh government rejected its indictment of some of the leaders of the Congress Party, including Minister Jagdish Titler and lawmaker Sajjan Kumar. Thanks to the outrage expressed by MPs from opposition parties as well as its own allies, the Manmohan Singh government was forced to make a U-turn in 2 days, leading to Titler's resignation from the cabinet. The Prime Minister went on to tender an apology to the Sikh community and the nation, admitting that the 1984 carnage was, in quotes, a great national shame and negation of the concept of nationhood, quotes closed. This was the closest the government of India came to acknowledging Rajiv Gandhi's monumental failure and complicity in the 1984 carnage. Whatever the symbolic value of Manmohan Singh's belated apology, the fresh inquiry did serve to fill a gap in knowledge base. It helped me and H.S. Phulka, the moving force behind the campaign for justice, to put together a book on the violence and its cover-up. Since the whole point of the fresh inquiry was to undo the mischief done by Mishra under the guise of fact-finding, the commission headed by former Supreme Court Judge G.T. Nanavati not only conducted its proceedings in public, but it also released a great deal of the old records related to the 1984 carnage. It was mainly on the basis of these belatedly released official records that Phulka and I came out with the book titled When a Tree Shook Delhi, the 1984 Carnage and its Aftermath. That there had been no such book for so many years may come as a shock to people in the US, where issues of lesser consequence generate a flurry of books. The difference betrays a larger malaise in India, an appalling lack of documentation culture, especially on human rights issues. Clearly, this deficiency is another reason for impunity. The electoral endorsement of the 1984 carnage and the impunity that followed set a template which has been applied with increasingly corrosive consequences. The Gujarat violence of 2002 targeting Muslims is the most egregious example of this trend, as it paved the way for Narendra Modi's elevation as Prime Minister in the recent election, giving a massive boost to the majoritarian Hindutva ideology. Much like Rajiv Gandhi was in 1984, Modi was first rewarded with a thumping victory in the 2002 Gujarat election, despite the violence on his watch as Chief Minister and Home Minister of the state. The carnage across Gujarat was triggered by the burning of a train in which 59 passengers had been killed following a clash between Hindus and Muslims at the Godhra railway station. Curiously, the very judge who had been entrusted with the re-enquiry into the 1984 carnage was chosen by Modi to probe the 2002 carnage as well. But in his avatar as a fact finder on Gujarat, Nanavati seemed to have taken a leaf out of Mishra's book. Despite an express mandate to probe the allegations against him, the Nanavati Commission refused to summon Modi for his testimony. Worse, despite the passage of 12 years, the Commission is still going through the motions of inquiry into Gujarat 2002. On the legal front, one redeeming aspect is that thanks to the Supreme Court's intervention in Gujarat, there have been far more convictions in 2002 related cases than in 1984 related ones. For the conviction of about 30 persons for murder in various cases related to 1984, the corresponding figure in 2002 is estimated to be over 200. But then there was a spate of acquittals to begin with in the Gujarat cases too. The flow was stemmed to some extent when the Supreme Court shamed the Modi regime by transferring the trial of a couple of high-profile cases out of Gujarat. In a further intervention, the Supreme Court appointed a special investigation team to deal with 9 of the gravest 2002 related cases. This was how the first ever conviction of a minister for complicity in mass violence came about. Maya Kodnani was found guilty of murder and conspiracy in a massacre at Ahmedabad's Naroda Patia, which had the highest death toll in a single locality in the 2002 carnage. If Modi himself survived what was apparently a higher level of scrutiny, it is because the SIT exonerated him of all allegations of conspiracy. But then, as a book I did on Gujarat 2002 demonstrated, the closure report filed by the SIT in 2012 had more to do with fact-fudging than fact-finding. Though it did examine Modi, the SIT made no attempt to challenge him on any of the evasive or contradictory replies given by him. Despite the much-touted Supreme Court's monitoring, the SIT glossed over, for instance, a telltale contradiction relating to the very first post-Godhra massacre, which had taken place at Gulberg Society in Ahmedabad on February 28, 2002. On the one hand, Modi claimed to have been engaged with a series of meetings on that day with law and order authorities to track violence on a real-time basis. On the other hand, he claimed to have been unaware of the the Gulberg Society massacre for as long as 5 hours after the last of the 69 people had been killed, and despite a prolonged siege preceding that bloodshed, right inside Ahmedabad. Hence, the title of my book is Oxymoronic, The Fiction of Fact-Finding, Modi and Godhra. From my study of 1984 and 2002, I gathered that a lot of the findings of official inquiries and investigations are not so much about uncovering the truth as about the insidious manner in which issues had been framed, facts selected, evidence recorded, or inferences drawn. Nothing illustrates this cynical expediency better than the failure to indict, let alone punish, any authority, political or administrative, for the massacre at Trilokpuri, which claimed the most number of casualties in the 1984 carnage. In just Block 32 of Trilokpuri, the death toll was estimated to have touched 400. According to the officially recorded testimonies of survivors, the police facilitated the massacre by driving the Sikhs out of a Gurdwara and leaving them at the mercy of a mob led by a local Congress Party leader. In a neighboring block, the police had even disarmed the Sikhs before the mob took over. The collusion was so pervasive that it took over 36 hours for the Block 32 massacre to come to light, although it was barely 10 kilometers from the Delhi police headquarters. The evidence available on Trilokpuri also nails the recurring claim that crimes targeting minorities are entirely or spontaneously the result of public anger. The anger in the public over Indira Gandhi's assassination, however deep it ran, was unlikely to translate into violence on such a large scale in Delhi without political instigation and administrative complicity. The same is true about Gujarat 2002 as well, notwithstanding Modi's exoneration by the SIT and a magistrate's endorsement of it. The pattern over the years shows that public anger is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for genocidal crimes. The small dent made on impunity in Gujarat cases due to judicial activism appears to have brought down the scale of targeted killings in India, but not their incidence. As the latest national election shows, religious polarization continues to yield electoral dividends. Given that he is the prime beneficiary of this electoral malpractice, Prime Minister Narendra Modi is hardly likely to deal with the causes of impunity. This is betrayed by the inclusion of a 2013 Muzaffarnagar riot accused Sanjeev Balian as a member or as a minister in the Modi government. Adding to the irony, Modi called for a 10-year moratorium on caste and communal violence as a policy measure for keeping the country focused on the challenges of economic development. But other leaders of his ideological fraternity have violated this moratorium in no time by stepping up their hate speech. Far from taking any action against violators of his moratorium, Modi has maintained strategic silence. By being in denial mode, by pretending that there was no escalation of religious tensions under his rule, Modi has effectively added another layer of impunity. Since he happens to be in DC this very moment, I do hope that President Barack Obama has, in the spirit of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, conveyed concerns to Modi about the fresh threats to secularism and the rule of law in India amid all the hype about governance and development. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sukhman Singh. I'm the co-founder of an organization called Ensaaf, which means justice, that works to end impunity and achieve justice for gross human rights violations in India with a focus on Punjab. I'd really like to thank the Lantos Commission for hosting this event and the Sikh Coalition for spearheading it, and thank all the attendees who took time to listen to what these distinguished panelists had to say. India, as we all know, is frequently regarded as the world's largest democracy. But I think it's clear from these episodes of gross human rights violations that there are serious questions about the nature and content of what makes Indian democracy. We have to ask ourselves, is democracy simply a process by which elections are held on a regular recurring basis, or are they based on more fundamental principles such as respect for the rule of law, respect for minorities, and the independence of the judiciary, especially as it applies to addressing serious and gross human rights violations? And I think when analyzed through that framework, it's clear that the culture and practice of impunity for mass state crimes in India has severely eroded the nature of democracy. And although India has achieved great technical achievements, for example, the media has highlighted how India has been the first country ever to successfully launch a satellite into the orbit of Mars. Is India reaching its potential with respect to the promotion and protection of human rights? And although the Indian government and perhaps some of its supporters may argue that these events have occurred in the past, I think that would certainly be a disingenuous analysis. According to the Indian government's own analysis from 2013, the Home Ministry reported over 800 incidents of communal violence, which led to hundreds of deaths and over 2,000 severe injuries. And that's just last year. But even with respect to these episodes of mass-scale violence in '84 and 2002, these episodes paved the way for implementing legislation and policy that institutionalized impunity for gross human rights violations. The '84 violence allowed the government to characterize an entire community as anti-national, as separatist, as a community that should be viewed with suspicion. This allowed the passage of extremely retrograde laws, such as the Terrorist Anti-Disruptive Activities Prevention Act, and its analogous law in 2002, known as POTA, which is directed at the Muslim community. Further, in 1988 or 89, Indian Parliament convened to suspend the right to life with respect to its applicability within the state of Punjab. And that's something that we have to seriously consider for a moment. You had a democratic country whose parliament convened to suspend the most fundamental human right with respect to just one minority community in the country. And so these so-called episodes of violence are really well-orchestrated events that serve larger agendas. They paved the way for what we now know as the decade of disappearances in Punjab, in which over 20,000 individuals were killed, largely because the government was able to win the support of public opinion to legitimize the violence. And we see very similar legislation in existence today to contain, from the government's perspective, threats imposed by the Muslim minority. I think it's extremely critical, given the black hole of human rights violations that India has found itself in, that the international community and the United States government engage India at every conceivable opportunity on its human rights record. And this is not something that would be new for the US government. The US government in '84 and in the decades following have consistently reported and documented the fact that there is a prevailing situation of impunity with respect to what happened in 1984, and also with respect to the disappearances and unlawful killings in Punjab perpetrated against Sikhs. The US State Department recently, several years ago, denied the current Prime Minister Modi a visa to enter this country because he was implicated in gross human rights violations in Gujarat. None of these things have changed. So the United States government, despite whatever opportunities regarding security cooperation economic ties that India presents cannot capitulate on its own values to respect and promote human rights in every corner of the world. And it cannot be selective and choose partnerships based on convenience. And it's critical that if the United States and India are true partners and true allies, that they have the type of relationship that allows it to cooperate both on trade issues, on security cooperation, but also on fundamental human rights issues that will truly benefit all of Indian society. And my colleague mentioned the, one concrete area where the United States can really engage India, I think, in a very productive manner is on a bill that my colleague mentioned, which is in short, the Criminal Violence Prevention Bill. This is a bill that ostensibly was designed to prevent in the future violence that occurred in 1984 and in 2002 and similar episodes of violence. However, there are tremendous efforts to undermine this bill. And it's important that the United States encourage India to include the provisions in this bill that will make it meaningful and ensure that this type of violence doesn't recur. And some of the specific provisions that this bill has to contain are the implementation of a widely accepted international human rights norm and legal regime known as superior responsibility, which simply holds that a superior who knew or should have known that gross violations were happening within their jurisdiction under their purview have an obligation to prevent and punish those crimes. And if they do not, they need to be held accountable. And there are numerous opportunities that occur in bilateral meetings, in international forum such as the United Nations, for the United States and other countries to constructively engage India on its human rights records. India is seeking an increasing dominant role in the international community. It would like a seat on the UN Security Council. But if India seeks this international leadership and wants this prominence and wants this authority, it needs to participate in the global trend for accountability for gross human rights violations as well. It needs to demonstrate that it truly is a modern democracy, not just in terms of process, but also in terms of content. And moreover, it has an ongoing obligation to the victims of gross human rights violations to vindicate their ever-present rights to truth, justice, and reparations. And unless and until it can do so, India will always be haunted by its legacy of gross human rights violations. What I found most troubling in my own experiences in representing and advocating on behalf of these victim families is that, and 84 is an illustrative example, that the process often becomes, the process of seeking justice and redress often becomes part of the punishment. In the context of the 84 abuses, there have been no less than 11 commissions and committees that have been instituted to look into this carnage. In disappearances and unlawful killings in Punjab, the litigation concerning the mass cremations case and some of these other episodes of mass disappearances have been going on for over 20 years. And one of the areas that India struggles most in is prosecuting these cases in an independent fashion and adjudicating these cases in an independent fashion. And again, this is a concrete area that I believe the United States and other international partners can help build the capacity of India to develop a robust ability to investigate and document and prosecute these abuses. But the prevailing point that I would like everybody here to take away with that was discussed before is that the survivors of these gross human rights violations have not given up. They continue to persist despite in the face of torture and persecution and economic ruin. And it's vital that these individuals be supported, not only because of their individual rights, but because of what it means for the rights of all other Indians in that country.
I'd like to request everyone here to give our panelists a round of applause. If there are any members of the media here or members of congressional staff or federal agencies, I want to prioritize Q&A for you. So by a show of hands, do you have any questions? And I'd be happy to direct you to any of our panelists. And don't be shy at all. This is a first time we're doing something like this, so we would love to initiate the dialogue here. Yes?
I just have a general question. Are the Indian people aware about the '84 massacre even now, and about the Gujarat massacre? And if they were, how is it possible that they elected Modi as their Prime Minister?
I'll refer you to Manoj for that particular question. The question is, are the Indian people aware of these instances of mass state violence?
Well, far from being unaware of these instances of mass crimes, India has this sorry record of having actually rewarded those who are perceived to have blood on their hands at the time of elections. In 1984, as I mentioned, Rajiv Gandhi won the biggest ever electoral mandate, and that election was held barely 2 months after the carnage. So there was no question of people having forgotten or being unaware of it. He milked that episode for electoral success. And something similar happened in 2002. After the Gujarat riots, Modi actually advanced the date of Gujarat elections in order to take advantage, political advantage from those killings, drawing inspiration evidently from the 1984 precedent. And as it happened, there was a slight delay because by then systems had evolved, Election Commission objected, then it was only after Supreme Court gave clearance for it that the election was finally held towards the end of that year. It was about 10 months after the event was over. And he went on to talk very unapologetically about what happened then post Godhra, and there was an instance of his having indulged in hate speech, which became a subject of fact finding for him, for the manner in which, the derogatory manner in which he referred to Muslims as hum panch hamare 25, and so on and so forth. So this is in the run-up to the state elections in Gujarat in 2002. So I hope I answered your question.
And he got a lot of heat when he used the analogy, when you run over a dog, you feel bad.
Yeah, that happened recently.
And this is very recent.
Yeah,
so obviously when you kill a human being, you will. And that became, I guess that was a slippage on his, the way he thinks.
Except that in the subsequent state elections and more so in the recent 2014 election, his whole effort was to reposition himself as an exemplar of development, governance, and he stood for economic development. That was the platform. There was policy paralysis, and to his good fortune, there was a lot of disenchantment with the previous government. They already had 2 terms, and they were embroiled in a lot of corruption scams. So all that went to his advantage. So this episode, this background of his receded into the background. So that helped him.
Yeah, is there a Indian media had a role in this whole thing? And it seems like they all been controlled and complicit in the position of the government in 1984 and in 2002. This is following her question that on the way the people react to this, the other side of the story, the victim side, has never been told in the way it should have been in a free press.
Yeah,
I mean-
that's the reason we made this film, and it was surprising when we went there. I had thought there was more coverage on what happened, at least more media was out there. But when we first spoke to the widows and entered the room, they said, you know what, in '84 there were people here. What happened to our voices? What happened to our stories? Did you guys not hear what happened to us? Because there was a media blackout and it was controlled, and we only got to see what the government wanted us to see. So the voices of victims never came out. We didn't see the relief camps. We only have those few pictures that we saw in Manushi magazine, where those testimonies of widows are available. So very limited pictures and video documentation. And that's why these widows were, they were grateful that we were out there, and they were happy to talk. I mean, it was difficult for them, but eventually they opened up because they had the opportunity and the platform to speak. And so we told them that their voices were not like the news media that came out in '84. And after that, it took a while for them to open up, because they said, you know what, this is hard for us. You guys come with your cameras and you tell us to talk. It happened in '84. No one heard our stories. You know, how are you going to do anything different 24, 25 years later? And I told them, we're not the news media of India. We're independent, and we're going to make sure that your voices are heard, and it's put into a documentary. So.
And that's why you took out the book, right? You need an unbiased, unfiltered, presentation of the facts.
Yeah, I'm concerned about the mainstream media in India, like big media, Times of India, Hindustan, Hindu, and the news channels. I mean, they are even today, they're more obsessed with the majority, and all they are losing the track of his record altogether, and they're not giving the concerns of the other people who are on the other side reasonable space in their newscasts. So I'd like to ask, because you're in the media, so what do you think about from Indian perspective, from Indian media perspective, what is the reason behind it? Is it controlled in a way that nobody can show the other side, or it's not in their national interest?
Well, I'll tell you, I was a part of this Aam Aadmi Party 3 months campaigning earlier in the first quarter of this year in Ludhiana with Mr. H.S. Fulka. So I was, and I know that there's no independent media, but to see it up close and realize it. So you would have TV channels and newspapers come and say, this is how much money we need. We will assign a journalist who will shadow you and cover your stories. Otherwise, you will have zero coverage. And so it's all for sale. And when I say all, I mean absolutely everything is for sale over there. And fear and intimidation and all of those other things. So it was a real awakening to understand that. And of course, H.K.L. Bhagat was the information broadcast minister back in '84. So he really was the one who was controlling what needs to be projected and how it needs to be projected. But there were a few, individual souls who actually did justice to some of this.
Yeah, I'm actually a member of the Indian media, and I couldn't agree with you more when you express this grievance that they only give expression to this majoritarian feelings and not give space for minority voices. And '84 is a very glaring example of that. That episode I mentioned of Block 32 massacre. There's no other explanation for it, that they were so led by the priorities set out by the state that it took over 36 hours for the media to blow a whistle on this massacre that involved some 400 people being killed, and it was in East Delhi, barely 10 kilometers from the police headquarters. And after that, when when people were not being arrested in the weeks following the carnage, and when Rajiv Gandhi was refusing to hold an inquiry, during those days, the media was not reflecting these human rights concerns. Instead, they were very swayed by the popularity that he enjoyed. They were literally eating out of his hands, and it's when you look back at it in retrospect, it is shocking to see that there's so little of the magnitude of this carnage reflected in the reports of that time. Of course, there were no private TV channels at that time. So what I'm talking about is essentially about print media, the mainstream print media. They did get carried away, and it's amazing to even think that it was within weeks of this massacre.
Yes, ma'am.
I just want to clarify. So you said there were about 2,700 deaths in Delhi, but how many deaths were there in total? And second question was, how many people have been convicted for the 1984 massacres?
So I'd like Sukhman and Manoj to address this question, please. The death toll from the 1984 anti-Sikh pogroms and how many convictions since then?
Well, the official account for Delhi alone is something around the number of 2,700 individuals.
2,733 to be precise, and it's a figure that they arrived at in 1987. So even that was after a great deal of delay.
But one of the reasons why we think those numbers are gross underestimates are for two main reasons. One, that number doesn't take into account the number of individuals that were killed outside of Delhi. And as recently as 2011, new massacre cases were discovered in a couple of villages in Haryana in which the entire Sikh population in these two small villages were massacred. And so we know that proper investigation and documentation has never occurred to uncover the true scale and scope of the massacres. Another reason why the extent of deaths has been obfuscated is because through the use of cremation practices, multiple bodies were cremated under one victim, under one victim's cremation pyre, so to speak. And so a public crematorium might indicate that 1,000 people had been cremated here, but given the way that the police and other individuals were surreptitiously cremating these bodies, we know that multiple bodies were being cremated under one name. And this is a practice that continued throughout the decade of disappearances in Punjab, where alleged terrorists who were killed by security forces, their multiple bodies were cremated under the name of one individual. But to answer your question, we don't know what the true scale and scope of the death toll is.
And to answer your question about convictions, yes, as we said, the death toll acknowledged by the state is 2,733 in Delhi alone, and all they have to show by way of justice for that, after all these years, is some total of 30 convictions for murder in about 12 cases. 30 persons convicted in 12 cases. This is the facts speak for themselves. How much impunity there has been with regard to 84.
Well, I'd like to actually make one point before I get to you, sir, and then ma'am. Mr. H.S. Fulka, who was featured in this video and who co-authored the book with Mr. Mitta, When a Tree Shook Delhi, in the full-length documentary, he made the point that during this carnage, in the course of 2.5 days, in New Delhi alone, over 2,700 Sikhs were killed by the government's own admission. That amounts to 1 Sikh every minute being killed in the course of 2.5 days. So can you imagine a situation, using a point that you made, Manoj, imagine a situation where in Washington, D.C., there's organized carnage against a minority community, and every single minute a human being is being brutally murdered. And another point that Mr. Mitta and Mr. Fulka have made is that these weren't deaths by gunshot, by and large. There was a very systematic pattern of violence. Women were raped, Sikh homes and businesses were earmarked beforehand for targeted destruction using voter registration lists and municipal records. White paint was often used to mark the homes and businesses of Sikhs for arson attacks. Sikh gurdwaras, or houses of worship, were systematically targeted for destruction. And men often had their long hair cut off. Sikhs are, as you know, religiously required to wear turbans over uncut hair and beards. Oftentimes before being murdered, the victims in these cases had their hair forcibly hacked off, which you saw in the video. And moreover, there was a pattern to the violence. Government officials, politicians, administrators supplied mobs with municipal buses to transport them to Sikh neighborhoods, and also supplied them with kerosene oil, gasoline essentially. And oftentimes, the Sikh victims of this carnage were beaten with iron rods and sticks and swords, doused with gasoline and set on fire, and essentially burned alive. So in this manner, thousands of people were killed in the federal capital of India over the course of 2.5 days at a rate of 1 per minute. So this is what this briefing is about. Sir, you had a question.
Harpreet Singh, Friends of American Sikh Congressional Caucus. Thank you for organizing this. But I just want to make sure that people understand this is November '84, whereas in June '84, would instigate everything, where people were killed at the Golden Temple attack, which the film indicates, which led to the murder of Indira Gandhi. There in one day, 10,000 Sikhs were killed. In one day, based on the prior estimation of wood required to burn one body, and multiple bodies were burned, and on and on. Mr. Mittal, you raised the question, what would happen if this happened in America? 6 victims were killed in Wisconsin, and the President of this United States raised, lower the flag at half-mast for 7 days until the funeral of those victims. This nation came to a stop still and acknowledged what a crime had been committed, and was one person wrong in this nation, this happens in that nation, in India, nothing is ever done for the victims of thousands of people. That's to be expressed of what this nation would do a democracy that we call the oldest democracy. But I would also like to thank many of the members who come here. My question is that, over the years, now we're doing 30 years, but when we rose and talked about these things, we were called terrorists, separatists in this country. It's taken 30 years to be able to have somewhat of not a hearing, but a discussion here about this. And when the American Sikh Congressional Caucus was formed, the ambassador from the DC Capitol came to this halls of this Congress and said this caucus should not be made. Why? Because the voice of the Sikhs would be brought to this country. So I ask you, when Modi comes here, it's convenient for him to talk about Sikh riots in Delhi because that comes on Indian Congress, not on his party. Yet we should talk about Modi and it was 10 years that he was not allowed to come into this country. So why is it convenient for Modi to talk about '84?
No, actually the situation is a little more complex. I wish we had a situation where each side was talking about the crimes committed by the other side. But that's not how it panned out. They realized that if they do talk about each other's crimes, then that would all be fresh in people's minds. So they seem to have a tacit consensus between themselves to keep quiet about each other's crimes. So after my book, for instance, on 2002 came in the run-up to the 2014 elections, Congress leaders were very wary of touching it because there were also references to '84 in that book. They thought that if they were to talk about 2002, fingers will be pointed at them about '84. Similarly, Modi has been very quiet about it. Like when Arvind Kejriwal, during his brief tenure as Chief Minister of Delhi, set up an SIT, a special investigation team to deal with November 1984 cases. There's been no progress on that front in implementing that decision in all these months. BJP government of Narendra Modi is not interested in raking up 1984 issues because they know that that would lead to the other side raking up 2002 related issues. So as far as both these parties are concerned, they believe that it is in their interest to move on, and that's the majoritarian attitude that these two mainstream parties reflect, and riding roughshod over concerns of human rights and so on.
I wanted to ask, who's benefiting from it? Like, I want to understand from the situation from the past. Obviously, it was a massacre orchestrated. I mean, I think it was pretty clear from the documentary that it wasn't just a mob, and it's very, very clear. But who is benefiting from it? Because obviously it wasn't just done for fun of somebody who is cruel. Who felt like a threat from the Sikh community, or why you think somebody would have done that in such a scope?
Sukhman and Manoj, if you'd like to.
Sure.
Sukhman.
Okay, it's a political calculation that they did, and they seem to have got their calculation right, as borne out by the fact that in a house of some 540 seats, they won over 400 seats. It's a kind of mandate that no government before or after got. The calculation was that during the insurgency in Punjab prior to November 1984, there were incidents of violence in which actually both members of both communities were killed. Not just Hindus. These people, the Sikh militants, were targeting Sikhs themselves in many instances. But whatever that might have been, there was this episode which the gentleman there was referring to, the attack on the Golden Temple. So that led to this, in turn, a situation where a couple of Sikh bodyguards killed Indira Gandhi. Now, against this backdrop, they decided that there was a lot of political mileage to make out of wreaking vengeance. And, as I said, people, objectively speaking, there was a lot of, it's not just Hindus who were angry, as the documentary I think showed, that a lot of Sikhs themselves, traditionally in Delhi, were supporters of Congress Party. So they were grieving as much as Hindu families were over Indira Gandhi's death. So it was something entirely engineered, orchestrated in that sense. Anger was there, shock was there, but for that to translate into violence of this nature, in which the police does not intervene, they either look the other side, or in some instances they go to the extent of actually aiding and abetting mobs. All this is indicative of orchestration. And the irony is, at the end of it all, when there was a judicial inquiry that was held, headed by no less than a sitting Supreme Court judge, he records much of this, yet comes to the conclusion that this does not, however, indicate any complicity on the part of the government or even the ruling party. At the most, some policemen down the line and some Congress Party members, again, at the bottom layers, must have done on their participated in it on their own, but no, instigation from above. I mean, it's a very, very, very tenuous, very debatable finding, but that's the nature of the mood at that time in 80s.
Any media? Ma'am, you're from the media. Would you have another question?
Can I ask a question of the representative of the commission?
I'm happy to answer one within my scope, sure.
Prime Minister Modi originally had a visa revoked, and now it's been approved, I guess, now that he's Prime Minister. What does that say about, what message does that give the world about the United States and its commitment to human rights? And what do you hope, or what can we hope that this hearing will achieve for this?
Well, not being able to speak for the administration or the State Department or anyone else, I will say that both the co-chairs of the commission are very strong supporters of the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998, under which the original visa revocation was issued. Beyond that, we as a commission have been fairly consistent and paid as much attention as we can with our limited resources to ongoing questions of human rights in India, particularly those of religious minorities. At this stage, given that the commission is a broad and bipartisan organization composed of members of both political parties, the commission itself doesn't have a position. I know you would have to address the individual members of the commission on what positions they hold on Prime Minister Modi's entering the United States and so on. But that's what I can tell you from the perspective of the commission itself. Sure. And are there any final questions? If there's maybe one or two more. Sure.
So you guys brought up like superior responsibility, and I guess that kind of means like command responsibility. I don't know if India is part of the ICC, but are you guys hoping to maybe bring that into the ICC? Is that like a goal, or like what are you kind of looking forward to doing, like the justice aspect outside of India? Because I know you guys want to make the U.S. involved and the international community.
Well,
Maybe Sukhman.
well, like the United States, India is not has not ratified the Rome Statute, is not a party to the ICC, and this is one of the problems for India and Asia as a region as a whole. It's completely lacking in any kind of regional body that is capable of receiving complaints of human rights violations. For example, in the South American system, you have the Inter-American Court and Commission. In Africa, you have the African Court and Commission. In Europe, you have European Court and Commission. But India hasn't even ratified the optional protocols to the UN that would allow individual victims to submit individual complaints to the UN for consideration. And for that reason, it's important, given the lack of international mechanisms that can hold India accountable, formally or informally, it's all the more important that the United States be able to use its bilateral relationships and activities to engage India on these issues, including working with India to incorporate principles of command responsibility or superior responsibility into its domestic legislation, so that it acts, one can hope, as a deterrence against future episodes of gross human rights violations.
Very good. If there are no further questions, I'd just like to thank Raj especially and all the participants, and for everyone who came to this informative and very instructive briefing and film screening. Thank you all again.
I think this briefing was a tremendous success. It demonstrates the strong interest in by the Sikh community, as well as individuals affiliated with Congress in understanding and redressing gross human rights violations in India. And given that this was the first briefing on the 84 pogroms and massacres, and including the 2002 Gujarat violence, I think it's a major milestone and achievement. And our hope is that this is a beginning of a dialogue that will lead to constructive change in India's human rights practices.
The Sikh Coalition is thankful to the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission in the U.S. Congress for organizing the first ever briefing on the November 1984 Anti-Sikh massacre, which claimed the lives of thousands of Sikhs throughout India. We hope that this will be the start of a series of discussions about the need to promote human rights and accountability in India and throughout the world. So again, we're very thankful to our friends here in the Tom Lantos Commission in the U.S. Congress, and we hope that this will be a small step forward in honoring those who lost their lives in India in 1984 and who have lost their lives since then. Thank you.